Well, I'm back out here again at Long Run Cemetery in Eastern Jefferson County, Kentucky. I previously did a video on it, and I've received a few emails asking me if I'd go a little more in depth about this place. So I was passing by today and figured it would be a good day to come and do that. So I'll cover a little bit of the history of this place and point out a few of the interesting inhabitants of this cemetery here. So we're back out here at Long Run Cemetery in Eastern Jefferson County, Kentucky. I've had a few emails specifically asking me a little more about two things here. One, what's the deal with where Abraham Lincoln's grandfather is actually buried? And two, someone asked me about Harry Truman. This property has a little connection with Harry Truman, and his great uncle is buried over that way. We'll walk over there in a minute. But I'll give you more of the backstory that I didn't get to very well in my first video. So, Captain Lincoln was the President Abraham Lincoln's grandfather, paternal grandfather. It says so right here on the stone. But this was his property deeded to him after his service in the Revolutionary War. And he came here with his family to farm this property. And he built a cabin right here. I'll get to how we know that in a minute. But Captain Lincoln was killed by Indians while he was working on this farm. He was working along, there's a creek that runs right along this wood line out here. And he was killed in an ambush while working the fields with his three sons. And so afterwards, his body was buried right next to his cabin. So how do we know his cabin was here? Well, this property, after his death, passed on to another gentleman, and we'll visit his grave in just a moment. But the property stayed in the Lincoln family for a few years. With their permission, locals started meeting for church services, worship services, and community meetings in the now abandoned cabin, which stood on the site where they rebuilt several times this church. So we do know, if you follow the church records back, that Long Run Baptist Church sat on this spot until a fire in 1964. That's the foundation you see here. Prior to that, there was a stone building that sat here. Some of the stones, according to the church records, were used in the foundation of the new building, this being the new building you see here, to build this in the late 1800s. Prior to that stone building, they still used the log cabin that the Lincoln family had, and it sat on the same site. All of them refer to it being on the exact same site. Now, I'm sure their cabin was not nearly as big as this church. In fact, the records of the Long Run Baptist Church showed that when the county acquired it in 1965, they had records that showed that the old church had been built, old being prior to this one, had been built on the exact same site as the cabin. And then this was built right over the top of that. So we know he was buried right here, right next to his cabin, which used to sit on this site. That's my long-winded explanation of that. We don't know exactly where he was buried around here, but it's got to be somewhere right in this vicinity. We know it was right here somewhere. So Captain Lincoln is buried right here. Next to him, we have Richard Chenoweth. He was also a captain in the Revolutionary War. It does say Virginia militia. Some people may not realize, but Kentucky was once part of Virginia. Jefferson County, Kentucky was actually once Jefferson County, Virginia. So this, at the time when Captain Lincoln was killed here, was actually a county of Virginia. We weren't a Commonwealth for many years to come. It's an interesting cemetery. It became a burial ground shortly after it started being used as a church. Let's kind of follow the history, how this worked first. I'll go over to the gentleman that bought it from the Lincoln family. So After Captain Lincoln was killed, his family left the property for several years. They did not return to live here. The property passed on in the Lincoln family to Mordecai Lincoln. And this sign is wrong on a date, I believe, but Mordecai Lincoln sold it to Benjamin Bridges, who was also a soldier in the Revolutionary War. Mr. Bridges bought this land from President Lincoln's uncle, one of the sons of Captain Lincoln. It says here 1954 this was deeded to the church. I think that has to be wrong, but I haven't really been able to find those records, so I'm not sure, but I know that the church was here for 100+ years before then, so it's probably wrong. Anyway, the property went from the Lincoln family to the Bridges family, and then from the Bridges family it went to the Long Run Baptist Church. And then after the church fire in 1964, the church sold this property to the Jefferson County, Kentucky government, who still owns the property today, and they maintain this property today through the Parks Department. So the cemetery is absolutely full. This is full. Looks like there's a lot of empty space. It's just that there are no stones. A lot of the stones have disappeared over the years. This was neglected for many years. In the 1970s, 80s, this area now is very developed. But the 70s, 80s, 90s, this was very rural. It was out in the country, and nobody really seemed to take much care of it. So in 1993, a relative or group of relatives from one of the prominent families of this area and who has many burials here, their name is Sturgeon. They came along and raised funds for restoration work here, and they put in a lot of the elbow grease and did a lot of the work themselves. So you see these stone enclosures here that are around a few of these memorial markers, like the one here. Those are the Sturgeon family. The Sturgeon family came along, and even the ones that weren't their family, they didn't build walls around them, but they did come, and you'll see these stones here were all laying on the ground at one time, and you'll notice they have concrete bases to them now. Those were picked up, put together where they could be. Pieces like this were placed together just so that they didn't get lost in the mix again and end up in the ground or just thrown in a trash heap. We do have several Revolutionary War soldiers buried here. Thomas Sturgeon Jr. is buried here. There's his government marker. We have a marker here provided by the Sons of the American Revolution. And then we also just have his regular grave marker here. You can see how that was pieced back together in a concrete mold. So that remains. The foot markers are still there. A lot of people don't understand how cemeteries work. I hear people, when they see these markers that have just 2 initials on it, they think that's children. That's not usually the case. In the late 1700s through the early 1900s, it became popular to have a head and a footstone. So you have your headstone and your footstone. So it shows you where the body lies. And the Sturgeons, they managed to find both their head and footstones in this cemetery and place them back where they belong. And you see a few of those here and there. A lot of times they get knocked over, especially with modern mowing equipment. They're in the way. They get hit with lawnmowers and they get broken over the years. So here's one that's broken. So this interesting for its time, this church, and in this part of the country, you got to remember Kentucky was a slaveholding state. Kentucky was a heavily segregated state, even up until the 1960s. It was heavily segregated. They did accept into their church black church members, which was unusual for this part of the country and for that era. Usually they were separate churches. So this is a marker for Edmund Gregg. Mr. Gregg, it says, born a slave, was a member of Long Run Church, and remained in the employ of his former master during his life. And he died in 1923. He was the last Negro member, that's an unusual word, a black member of the congregation. His name is, I can kind of see it, it's scratched into here, but there's his stone. We're going to walk over this way a little bit. This area was actually a separate cemetery from the Baptist cemetery over there. It was its own little family cemetery, and it was incorporated into this at some time. But there was a separate area here just for this family. This little area over here. This collapsed pile of stone at one time was a vault, a burial vault. I don't know the name of the person that was, or the family that was interred in this vault. I have managed to find records on this cemetery and a map of this cemetery that was hand drawn sometime around 1923 that made reference to this being a vault. And sometime since the 20s, it's collapsed in, and now we have a pile of stones here. So we don't really know who's buried here. But that's what's left of a family vault. Now, up the front of this cemetery, there's a plaque that says that this area is historic ground. And it has ties to not only President Lincoln, but also to President Truman. And President Truman's family lived in this area. His great uncle was a member of this church, and he is buried right over here. Warfield Young, who died in 1865. He is buried right here. And I can't find a whole lot of information on him. However, one of his family members did contact me and ask for a little more information on who was buried here. So that's one of the reasons I came back out here today when I was driving by to see this. I just figured I'd make this video. I couldn't believe how much interest my first video got. People emailed me with questions about this, and a lot of the answers I just didn't know. History, local history, specifically in this area of Kentucky, is one of my hobbies, and you know, I studied it for years, and there's only so much you can remember. So I couldn't remember what to tell this woman that contacted me, so I figured I'd stop out here and see what I could come up with. And I did a little research, and all I could find was a name. But the cemetery is in what is now a very populated area. There are neighborhoods everywhere around here. And, you know, I wonder its future. Hopefully it's maintained as well as it is now. Here's another entrance that used to be here on the north side of the cemetery. When there was a church here, there was an entranceway that went over the road behind here. This now is a private road behind here, and it's just someone's driveway at this point. There used to be a farm road that went throughout the area. There was a well here at one time. In some of the online information I could find marking where graves were, it would make reference to how many feet from the well. So that's where the well was. This is the last remaining piece of fence. Now this fence was here in a 1926 reference to this cemetery. There was a picket fence around here, and then the fence that you see here now was put up in the 1950s when the congregation decided it was time for a new fence. But it used to be surrounded by just a wood picket fence, and this is the only piece of that fence left right here. And that was in 1926, and it referred to that being the old fence. So this has been here for a long time. Look how that, where there used to be a gate, like how that's put into this stone with driven in bolts just to hold that in there tight. There's another one down here. Gates have long since disappeared. I guess they were either taken for scrap or reused for something. There's another set of gates over here. We're going to go out that way. The graves run in this entire cemetery in more or less a north-south direction. Straight ahead of me now is facing south. A lot of broken stones here that have fallen over. Here's some more that have been repaired. Look, they couldn't repair this one and put it in one piece. So they just put it in three separate pieces into one piece of concrete. That's kind of clever. And at least it saves it here in place. You can read the name and the date. This person died in 1855. This is the only plot with a small gate around it over here. (1830) 1889. So this has been here for a while. The last burials I could find that took place here were in the 1940s, up in the backside of that private part of the cemetery that's now been taken over with the rest of this. The records that I could find said that every spot here is taken, is entirely full of graves. And even though it might not look like it these days, it at one time was very full of headstones. At the front, we have a tree here that was grown from a seed of an acorn tree, or white oak tree, excuse me, that President Abraham Lincoln stood under and spoke under. And so this tree was grown from an acorn from that oak tree. And I guess that's how they're going to circle around and have a piece of history from one generation of the Lincoln family to the next into today's world. We got a nice white oak tree here. It says he stood under that tree and delivered a speech in 1840 for his presidential campaign of William Henry Harrison. So, here's the other set of gates that leads out of the cemetery. We'll go down and look at this plaque that the county put here when they built the thing. When the county took over, they improved this back in the 1960s. And they did a good job of it. Then they just kind of left it. This talks about Mr. Sturgeon, who I mentioned earlier. He came in the 90s, 93 roughly, and fixed up this cemetery. And this is just a little something recognizing his restoration efforts here. And then we have this plaque here, which was put in by the county when they purchased this land. I was wrong on those dates. 1961, they bought it earlier than I thought they had. So if you want to read this, you can stop and read it. I might attach a picture of it if I can, just so you can read it a little better. But there you have it. This is the Long Run Cemetery and former site of the Long Run Baptist Church. And that's what it looks like. And as always, I hope you have a great day.